Steve, Mike, thanks very much for joining the conversation. Good to see you both. Your take on this story this morning first.
Well, after all that's said is done, there was either a catastrophic failure of that aircraft or a catastrophic failure in security on multiple levels. We have to remember that this aircraft landed in 4 or 5 locations before it got to Charles de Gaulle Airport.
That's exactly what Sebastian Gorka said.
Where was security? And if it is a terrorist attack, and it's an if it was a terrorist attack, every airport in this world, on this planet, has to wonder how in the world did a bomb get on that aircraft?
Yeah, Mike Becker, it was several airports that this plane had gone to beforehand. Right. You wonder if, in fact, a bomb was brought in one of those, maybe one of those places was where the vulnerability was.
Yeah, you can't discount anything at this point, which is part of the problem with any investigation like this. But you've got to build your investigation on facts. And these investigations follow a certain set of protocols. So that's what they're doing right now. They're looking in terms of the security side of things and the possibility of terrorism. They're looking at the passenger manifest. They're looking, as you said, they're peeling back all the points where it touched down prior to heading into Cairo. Who had access to that plane? Yeah. So they have to follow this process. It's very unsatisfying for people because we all fly, we all want to know what happened, but the honest to God's truth is, look, we got flights from years back, including an EgyptAir flight from 17 years ago. We still don't know what happened to it, and it went off the coast of Massachusetts.
Yeah, you know, I got to tell you, I have flown EgyptAir, and as I look at that airplane, I say to myself, you know, so many of us are vulnerable now that the summer is coming, but like Mike and like Steve, here's the bottom line. It's an investigation. So you've got a solid aircraft and you've got an experienced pilot. You don't have weather problems, but you've been through areas where terrorists have attacked recently. And the biggest problem, I think, with Egypt is that they are constantly under attack. I mean, after the revolution in 2013, when Morsi was overthrown, El-Sisi went in, I mean, the terrorists have done everything they can to stop the tourist industry in Egypt. And it is one of the, you know, most sought-after places in terms of the ancient ruins and the history of Egypt, and I think it's really going to kill their tourism.
But even going back, it's their handling of it and the lack of transparency, which the former head of the NTSB told Maria just last hour, who worked on investigating that very aircraft that went down in '99, took off from JFK. To this day, Egypt insists that it was a mechanical failure. The U.S. authorities determined that it was the co-pilot that drove that plane into the sea. And I was listening to the Egypt's aviation minister talk about this. Now, granted, we're listening to a translation, but he used the word vanished flight repeatedly. Not crash, which is what we heard from Francois Hollande, that this plane crashed. He said vanished. This is not In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. This is not some story about the Bermuda Triangle. This is an airplane crash. And they have trouble calling it even that at this point.
But you remember what happened after Malaysia, right? After the Malaysian airliners, the theories that were thrown out there and the way that was talked about, and it disappeared out of thin air. And then, but more to the point, with that incident, we remember how difficult it was to get any support to the Malaysian authorities. They didn't want
the support.
And there's one other factor that we have to keep in mind, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be an organized terrorist group if, in fact, it's a terrorist act. It could be a lone wolf. So this is why, to your point, there has to be a comprehensive investigation, and the totality of information that comes together will point in the direction it is, including the black box.
But based on what you're hearing so far, the fact that witnesses saw fire in the air, the fact that the flight goes off radar 30 minutes before it's supposed to land, do you think that this is terrorism? And what do you want to hear from this press conference? Obviously, we're not getting any information from the officials.
What you just articulated, plus a very important point, is the pilot had no chance to give any communication. That was determined this morning, correct? Well, all of that points to the direction of a terrorist attack.
And what about the swerving? They said that the plane swerved. What does that tell us?
Pressure. The decompression of the cabin will...
Yeah, I'm not an aviation expert, but I mean, look, you can't read too much into the lack of communication from the pilot. That's their first job, is to solve the problem, right? So their last job is to communicate, and you know, they're focused on what's happening in that cockpit. If there had been a hijacking effort, for instance, though, if he'd been in the cockpit, you would have assumed possibly they might have gotten that word out. But we don't know. what happened with the swerving could have been also a catastrophic failure, a mechanical failure of some sort that could have caused this. And again, I keep going back to the same point, is this follows certain process, this follows certain protocols, and sometimes it's extremely unsatisfying.
Let's assume that there's a hijacking, okay? People would have their iPhones, their BlackBerries, I mean, and this is something that we could ultimately determine if we go back and try to identify tweets, emails.
Well, you brought up a very important point, too, about, excuse me, transparency. Look, these catastrophic events affect their economy, and do they really want to put the word out that there is another terrorist attack? That's a very good point.
Well, I think you made the point earlier that tourism is down. What did you say, Dagan? 66%?
The tourism revenue just in the first 3 months of this year was off 66% from a year ago. The number of tourists visiting the country has been cut almost in half to 1.2 million from 2.2 million in the first quarter of last year. But again, in dealing with that Russian jetliner that was taken out by terrorists after it took off from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt still, the investigators there won't address it and call it terrorism. Now, President al-Sisi did call it terrorism, finally, at the end of February. But Western investigators and Russian investigators said it was terrorism in November of last year. So they tried to... It's not a cover-up, but they won't address it.
But it's a hinder of our investigation.
Al-Sisi, the thing about al-Sisi, and we met with him a couple of years ago, is he's a man who clearly understands the danger that Egypt is in, clearly understands that they are under attack, and I'm not so sure that it's not a translation issue, or because this is a guy who understands and has been asking us for years, you know, that we need the support from the United States.
Wouldn't you say their failure to share this critical information endangers all of us? They have to share information with the international community. You're right, Judge.
Right. But there's an element of cover-up there. There's an element of lack of transparency. Sometimes it's an element of lack of experience and capability with their personnel who are charged with investigating. Some part it's a national pride issue. That was the problem with Malaysia. Was they had no interest in saying that they had to cede authority to others who were better equipped.
But isn't tourism 80% of their economy?
It's the vast majority of their economy.
I think it's at least 80%. It's crazy.
Look, I mean, you don't want to rush to conclusions, obviously, here, but what we heard from the Egyptian aviation minister earlier was nothing. I mean, he kept saying it's too early to tell and would not really rush to any judgment whatsoever. But as you look at some of these facts that we have, it is suggesting increasingly that there was something that had
But until he knows, you know, he's got to say, we don't know yet.
And I don't blame him for that at all. I mean, I think that's, again, you have to base, it's like any other investigation, it has to be based on something solid. You have to release the details, the facts. You can't, and he's not in a position where he can speculate. So, and these witnesses, you know, with the fire, witnesses tend to be somewhat unreliable.
What holds the facts? What holds the facts is what's in the black box. That will hold the key to all of this.
What's in the black box? Sure, but what's the timing on that? When will we get those details?
A while.
But once we get them, at least you may not hear it, whether it's terrorism or not. And that's a smart move on his part.